Are you Warren Jeffs?
Yes.
All right, Mr. Jeffs, you're being held as a fugitive, and there are 2 fugitive holds for you, one from Utah, one from Arizona. I'm going to explain to you very quickly what your rights are in regards to being a fugitive from justice.
Yes.
Okay, what would you like to do?
Go ahead and be extradited.
You want to waive your rights in regards to extradition and go back as quickly as they can have they can come pick you up?
Yes.
All right.
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Cultish, Entering the Kingdom of the Cults. My name is Jeremiah Roberts. I am one of the co-hosts here. I am here with Andrew, Super Sleuth Andrew, the Super Sleuth of the show. How are you, man?
I'm doing well, man. Thank you. I hope you're doing well as well.
So, as always, I say I'm super excited for this episode, particularly because I'm of the opinion that there are 4 horsemen of the last 100 years as far as notorious cult leaders go. Jim Jones, Charles Manson, David Koresh, and Warren Jeffs. Those are the people, when you think of cult, that's what comes to mind. When you every probably twice a year, Time Life magazine, or one of those magazines you'll see on the grocery shelf, they'll have some magazine about cults, and usually it's those 4 that you see. It's actually one of our logos on Cultish, I think on the banner cover for our Facebook page. We have those 4 cult leaders. So this is, we are here with Briell Decker. How are you?
I'm doing good.
And so we are here today really to be flies in the wall. You grew up in the FLDS. And we talked a little bit on the phone. You were married to Warren Jeffs at the age of 18. And you were wife number 65.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to be a fly on the wall. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay. So, my parents, when they were 18, they went through the line in our churches then. They believe that God, the leader, there's one man that holds the keys of the priesthood that is the leader of the church. And after church, we would walk, everybody in the whole congregation would walk through and shake his hand. And when my father went through, this is a story they told me, when he went through, they pulled him aside. And then my mother, they pulled her aside. And then they told them they were going to get married. And they had only heard of each other. They had never met.
Oh, wow.
And so my point is that appointed marriage is a big deal in the FLDS, which is the group that I was raised in and that Warren Jeffs now leads from prison. So I was a product of appointed marriage, and I remember going to school in Apologia Academy where Warren Jeffs was the principal. He was 17 when they asked him to be the principal of that school, and he was the only principal ever of Apologia Academy. When I started in first grade, his first wife was my teacher. And later anyway, I don't want to give away everything, but so I remember going to class every morning. We had to be there by 8 o'clock in the morning, and we listened to church doctrine, Warren Jeffs' interpretations, because he was the principal.
Right.
And one of the things that he taught us very in detail was that we had a choice. We all have a choice. At the wedding, we can say yes or no. And I remember really young questioning, but I didn't dare tell anybody that I questioned. I just silently in my mind, I just remember thinking, if they've never heard of each other, how do they know if they should say yes or no?
Right.
And then when I was 6 years old, so it was shortly before I think it was during this when I was in first grade, it was around 6 and 7. My oldest brother and my oldest sister got married in an arranged marriage. And my oldest brother had a wife that was severely diagnosed with a mental illness that she wouldn't take care of. And it had really bad consequences for the children later and so many things. And as I grew up from 7 to 8 years old, I remember questioning even more. You know, if it's not choice because you've never heard of each other, then it must be trust. But I don't really trust these guys because I don't see any reason why my brother should have gone through that. And I remember thinking that in my mind. I'm like, I don't really trust them because they say that, you know, there's always an excuse of not being good enough and we need to atone for our sins somehow. But I didn't think that applied to my brother. Like, he didn't deserve that. It was his first wife. He always didn't really feel like he had hope of qualifying for more because he couldn't even perfect what he had. And you have to have at least 3 in the FLDS to be able to make it into the highest degree of glory in the celestial kingdom. But you have to qualify. It's like and it was almost impossible, especially for the boys, because they were competition. I believe they never say that, but they usually said they were priesthood bearers, so they had every right to have a harder. They were the ones that made the rules in the house, and the ladies were like just supposed to keep sweet, and everybody's supposed to keep sweet, but the ladies for sure had to keep sweet because they didn't get to make any decisions.
So who appointed these marriages? Like
the leader.
The leaders.
The leader had full say. But when I was really young, I don't really know what age then. I think I was a year old when Warren Jeff's father, became the leader. And so I don't remember when that happened, but and then he had a stroke like when I was really young. So all I remember of Briell Jeffs was that he was handicapped kind of. And Warren Jeffs was the spokesman and the one that made things happen through him kind of, you know, used his name and stuff.
So he was
That's all I
speaking
knew.
on his behalf.
Yeah, he spoke a lot on his behalf and took care of him, and he actually taught us in our school because he had in-depth training on history, which was church history. We never had world history in our schools. And in this church history lesson, he went over how the regular LDS church split, how the split happened. And he described it as so there was 3 leaders that were, Joseph Smith was the first one, Brigham Young was the next, and then John Taylor. And those are still leaders of the LDS mainstream church. And then he claimed that there was a secret meeting that John Taylor had called the 8-hour meeting, that he set apart 8 people to carry on polygamy no matter what. And then he passed away without telling everybody about the meeting. And so there was before him, the next leader, Brigham Young, was after Joseph Smith. He was the highest position, appointed position in the church at the time. So he kind of got the authority. And this is how Warren just described it. He said, Wilford Woodruff was in that position. And so everybody voted him in. The church members decided to vote him in. And he said that was all done wrong because God chooses who the leader really is, whose heart is right. And so that's kind of how he also usurped authority to become the leader, is because he said God chose. You don't get any say in it. God just decides, and then you either follow or you don't.
Wow, that kind of reminds me of like the arranged marriages you're talking about. Like he says you have a choice, but really you don't, because if you don't choose what the prophet says, now you're disobeying God.
Right.
In a sense. Yeah.
Right. That the whole time it was like what we were allowed to hear was only what the church allowed us to hear. And they taught us that if we heard news or media or anything from a different source, it was tainted with lies, and the devil will tell 100 truths to slip in one lie. So we couldn't have television after, like, I was 9 years old and that got outlawed. We couldn't have any movies of any kind. We couldn't have.
Wouldn't they call it Gentile? He would always call this as like the Gentile media, or Gentile this, Gentile that.
Or apostates,
Or
even like on the
Gentile
news
apostate,
and
yeah.
stuff. He didn't want people hearing outside sources at all. He had already told us that music wasn't okay before I don't even remember when that happened. I think it was before I was born. And then, because I don't ever remember listening to outside music, like, unless somebody was just like breaking the rules. Like, I knew they were breaking the rules when I heard the beat and different things.
Yeah.
And then television was outlawed when I was about 9, and then internet was outlawed we called it outlawed, when I was in Warren Jeff's family. And there was something else. I can't remember the other thing. It will come to me. But yeah, all of those things. So books too. He got to where they all had to be handmade. They couldn't have pictures that weren't taken by you and
Wow.
stuff like that. So, and the music was all made by the church too. Like we had music. It was just piano. They couldn't have a drum or anything in it.
I've actually listened to some of Warren Jeff's him singing with the piano, so I kind of know just a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wish I heard that. I never heard that.
Yeah, I think it was one of the videos you sent me. But yeah, it's definitely, there's definitely, I can only imagine what it must be like. And again, I'm a movie connoisseur, but there's an M. Night Shyamalan movie that came out. It was back in 2004, The Village. And the whole aspect is there's this, and you haven't seen it by now. I'm sorry, spoiler. You should have seen it. It came out in 2004.
I think I might have saw The Village.
Okay. But
I think
yeah,
so.
it's, you see these people in the whole movie, you think you're living in the 1800s, and what you find out, it was actually this isolated community, and even above where they were, there was a no-fly zone, so there were no planes flying over, so people literally thought they lived in the 1800s, and it wasn't until you find out at the end of the movie, no, it's not the case. They're living in the modern day. There's this whole, whatever the agenda was, but yeah, I just real quickly, I just remember. As much as I can remember seeing the news when this happened, you can go back in the story, but just seeing people that looked at it, who were dressed and they looked like something out, like a set piece out of Little House on the Prairie.
Like a pioneer.
Yeah, it's, and even you using the language outlaw. That's like, and I love it too.
Oh,
'Cause
wow.
I grew up loving westerns too. That's definitely like 1800s Western language, but I love it. But, anyways, go ahead.
Yeah, our language is a lot different. Like even the interpretations that the Bible has. And like grace in the Mormon church means mercy, and grace in the Bible is not mercy at all. It's so I've learned some of the different interpretations of the same word.
Yeah.
That's just it intensified to a major extreme in Warren Jeff's group.
Yeah.
That not everybody is like aware of, but yeah, they are so extreme in every way. So like anyway. I'll keep going with the story.
No, go for it.
So anyway, I went to school. I learned about like constant indoctrination, like every day. And one of the things he taught us was about when our turn came for our arranged marriage. We could never date. We could never even, they would separate the girls and boys in like 4th grade. If we even thought a bad thought, then we had to confess it. We were taught to confess or tattle on people if they told you instead of the leader. And it was like a punishable sin that you could actually be sent away, lose your family and everything forever.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It was like a really it was like almost like there's a verse in the Doctrine and Covenants, I think, that talks about, I don't know if it's in the Bible, but it talks about if you even thought about somebody else and that isn't good,
Right. Yeah.
then it's somehow a punishment. Anyway, so they applied everything to the extreme.
Yeah.
And even children, like because at 8 years old even in the Mormon church, they believe that you get baptized at 8 years old, and in their interpretation of baptism, it's not the same as Christianity. Their interpretation of baptism is that once they are baptized, then Jesus stops atoning for them and they have to earn it after that. And I didn't know that until after I was baptized, of course. Like my parents sent me down and told me, okay, now you get to earn it, and I would have never done it if, I really understood, but I was young too.
Right.
So that was a big deal at 8 years old. So once you turned 8 and you were baptized and Jesus stops atoning for you, if you do something that isn't right or in any way, then there's consequences. And they say you should start teaching your children really young so that by the time they're 8, they have some idea what the consequences are.
Yeah, what are they?
So, like, if it's a simple thing, like, I mean, if it's just like they stole something or something, then it would be like maybe sit on the chair, for 15 minutes, or, they always have consequences. If it's something like I've even heard of 8-year-olds being dropped off on the side of the road.
Wow. So do these consequences, is it supposed to put them in favor with God? Like it's a form of atonement for doing something wrong in a sense?
It's to teach them it's better to be good than it is to be bad.
Okay.
So, they say that if you don't understand, there's a Doctrine and Covenants quote that says if you don't understand the scriptures by the time you're 8 years old, which is really young,
Yeah.
then the sin goes on the head of the parent. So that's why the parents are so determined to baptize their kids and stuff, because they don't want to carry that weight.
Wow, that's heavy.
That's too heavy.
An 8-year-old, yeah, that's too heavy. It's impossible. So I want to hear something like take me back to your childhood. Like, was there ever a time where the modern world like just got thrown into your world? Like, say like there's a car driving through your town with the windows rolled down and there's like music blasting that you've never heard before. Like, is there anything like that happened? Like, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Salt Lake. So I was in the
okay.
FLDS.
Gotcha.
But I was born around, the world was all around me.
Oh, okay.
We just had pine trees. We had almost an acre lot. And we had pine trees all around the border. And we always saw people and stuff in my world. But I did notice, like, later, when Warren Jeffs got really strict, the children didn't have that luxury. And when the raid happened in Texas, there was 7-year-olds that had never seen somebody with a different color skin. Like, they didn't even know they existed, and they were really traumatized.
Yeah, because they're taught that they're bad, essentially. People of like with different color skin.
He would hide things from them. Like they had never been outside of the walls of the city, so of his little compound thing. So they actually thought they were gorillas. Like,
wow.
Yeah, it was pretty sad, but.
When it came to your especially with your upbringing, a lot of times cult members will, especially growing up, you're isolated from the outside world, but then as far as like your education goes and learning skill sets, whatever they are for how to actually like deal with the world, a lot of times that's denied as well, because typically you might be doing some sort of like labor or work or things like that. There's a lot of times where that's affected people, for example, who grew up in Scientology, where they're going through the Scientology learning courses and they're part of, a lot of times their parents are part of the Sea Org, and so they're in some sub school, and if something happens where a lot of them have left, they end up just being sort of thrown into this world that they're just not prepared for, because all they've ever known is this. As far as education goes, maybe you could talk about that generally, and then like talk about yourself, as a girl growing up in the FLDS. What was that like?
Yeah. So they tried to scare us away from the truth. Now I know that. I didn't know that when I was being raised in there, and all I could hear was what they had to say. But now that I know the difference and I've experienced the difference, I know that they had a lot of tools and tactics to blindside us, to do what they wanted us to do instead of what was logical or what might actually be better. So an example of that is like, one of my sister wives had a really sad story one day. She was talking about so she grew up in a ranch, with just her brothers and sisters. Her family was the only people there. She met, she knew the church. She was in the church her whole life. She knew people, but she didn't daily interact with people other than her family. So it's like a really prairie, and then she marries Warren Jeffs later. And she had a hard time because he corrected her father. And she gets up one day and he told her to tell us this story about how she was having a hard time with it for like a month. She wouldn't talk to him when he called her. And so he punished her. And what he did is he called the caretaker, the person who was watching the household, buying the groceries and everything. 'Cause she was struggling. He had a house in hiding that she was living in. He had the caretaker go and buy some clothes that were like Gentile clothes, and told her to like put them on, wear them. And he drove her all the way to Vegas, and it was the middle of the night, like 10 o'clock at night, she said. They gave her one little phone and told her to walk down the street in the middle of the dark in Vegas and watch. He said, I want you, Warren Jeffs told her, I want you, because he talked to her on the phone, and he's like, I want you to stare at all of the graffiti and all the stuff and just see what you will be like if you don't stay faithful to the church.
Oh my goodness, he's terrifying her.
Put her, and she's telling us the story, so it's putting all of us into like this contrast shock.
He's vicariously speaking to you through her, through this traumatic experience that he put through her through.
Yeah.
Wow.
And she walked, that was life-threatening. In Vegas, like in the middle of the dark, all alone. And so she walked down the street and she kept crying. She said she was crying and crying, and then he would call every once in a while, and she would say, is it over? Is it over? And he's like, no. And he would just hang up, and, it was really cruel. Like, and in the end, he didn't let it be over for like a whole nother day, like he sent her to a hotel and told her to watch TV, and just, it was just so, it's not how the world is at all. And so the way that they portray it is not accurate. There's a lot of good people in this world. There's, I know that now. But they do tell you it's a scary, dangerous, bad place. And another thing about the Bible, they don't explain so much detail about how love versus works is. And that's a really big deal, because if you really knew the Bible, there's so many solutions.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But they hide it all from you. And they know that they're hiding it from you. Mm. So, and they get to study, like they have leaders who are appointed to study what's really going on out in the world.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. Just so they can protect themselves and, keep themselves in check. But not everybody is allowed to do that. So, yeah, they know.
Yeah, of course. There's like three different options. If you're someone claiming to be a prophet, it's either that you're mentally disturbed thinking that you're talking to God, or that you're talking to maybe a spirit that's an evil spirit, could be deceiving you, or the third option is that that you're not a prophet, and you're doing these things to control and manipulate people, and you get pleasure from it. Like that's kind of terrifying.
Yeah, he was he did like to, it seemed like he liked taking hope away from people really slowly and painfully, and there's so many people that suffer from that,
Yeah.
Just it's devastating, the trauma that, like he would find out what you liked and then just like use it against you.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Another thing too, because you talked about being put on the outside of the road, and we talked on the phone. Maybe you just know, this is more a different vantage point, but this is something that was a prominent story that came up with Warren Jeffs, is that there were boys who continually from my understanding, would continue to show up in Salt Lake or in other places in Utah because they had been kicked out.
Yeah.
Because from my understanding, Jeff saw them as they get older as competition, and he didn't like that. And so a lot of them would get just kicked out because they violated some rule for a particular reason. That was always vague and arbitrary. It was just, this is how it is. I'm the prophet. You've sinned. You're now a Gentile. You're out.
And these people were illiterate and like with barely any education at all.
Yeah. So like I was telling you how the boys had the rules that were stricter. It was really easy to make them so strict that they couldn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that happened so much. People don't even realize as often it happened. And it started to get to be parents, especially later when Warren Jeffs became the leader. And he didn't like teaching parents because they have the option to leave. Mm-hmm. He wanted to, and he's a pedophile too, so he likes children, and also he traps them in until they're 18. Like he had the parents sign away their rights to the church for their children, saying everything belongs to God, sign this paper, it's legal, and it's not legal. But the parents don't always know that. Mm-hmm. And so they sign their children over to the church, And then he calls them up and tells them, you aren't worthy of your kids. You need to go and repent, go to a house far away and send me money. And they do it because they just want to someday see their kids again.
Yeah. As far as the theology, I want to just get your thoughts on something, because this is going to go in a couple different avenues. At least what I'm going to try and do is that polygamy. Initially, that was something that was started by Joseph. And then Brigham really kind of brought that to the forefront. And then it wasn't until where the Mormon Church was threatened to be exiled into Utah when they then had a revelation to get rid of polygamy. But Section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants has never been removed from the LDS Scriptures. It's still part of the canon. So I've always seen there's this conflict between what's being said and even the argument that subsects of the current Mormon Church could make the argument against them that they're the ones who have apostatized and that we're the ones who need to restore it. Would people in the FLDS, they believed in polygamy, that was a central aspect of their doctrine or of the gospel of Jesus Christ, but would they also talk about the current Mormon Church, that they were an apostate, or what's your perspective on that from their vantage point?
So actually I only know Warren Jeff's interpretations really,
Okay.
because like I said, he ruled his father and then he was the one that became the leader next. But he actually compiled all the books of all the leaders in the FLDS. So even if somebody else said it, he chose if it got to be put in the book.
Wow.
So yeah. So what I would say about Warren Jeff's interpretation of the LDS Church is his father actually was a convert from the Mormon Church. But he said because they're really racist, when the Mormon Church updated their doctrine and got away with racism, then that was when they apostatized.
So it was Spencer W. Kimball who got the revelation.
Yeah.
And that's when Rulon Jeffs left? That was Warren Jeffs' father, right?
No, Rulon had already been a convert for years.
Okay.
I don't know when he became a convert, but I think it was before that.
Okay.
And so, yeah, he was very, like, I don't know any of the groups, branches off of the LDS Church that aren't racist. Like, all of them are pretty much have their twist on racism.
On the fence sitters.
Yeah. It's crazy, but, I don't really, like, I have some ideas on because of what I went through, but it's kind of far-fetched, and I'm going to put it in my book because I need the sequencing to be able to explain some of the concepts and stuff. Like, there's certain things that if you saw how the indoctrination got so intense, it's easier to understand.
For sure.
But so in my story, when I went to school and I was just constantly being indoctrinated with what they wanted me to hear, and then I remember being told about when our turn came to be married, there would be like 3 different routes the leader would go to be able to decide who your partner was. And one of them was he would just tell you, your partner so-and-so, like what happened to my parents. Or, he told us this like if you listen, he had a whole book on polygamy called The Enlightened Truth that he wrote.
Jeffs did.
Warren Jeffs, yeah. And there was another route that he would like ask you if you had an impression from God yourself of who you were supposed to marry, and then if you lie, then there's a consequence. So, and then the other route was that the last route was if he says you need to go away and pray and figure out and come back to me and ask me if you think so and so is supposed to be your partner, and then I'll tell you yes or no. And all of them, he has the ultimate say.
Right.
So, as a child, I remember I would like get premonitions. I don't know if you guys know, I don't know who believes in premonitions, but I know that's what it's called when I would dream that the room was lit, darkly lit, and that Warren Jeffs would turn to me and he'd say, "Do you have an impression of who you're supposed to marry?" And I remember waking up every time at that point. Like, I would just wake up out of a dead sleep, even as a little girl. And I got teased my entire life, because in a situation where you don't have any choice, like you're not dating, it's a different kind of tease. It's like everybody's looking at the leader to decide what he might, who he's, what he's acting like.
Yeah.
And so my whole life I was teased about marrying Warren Jeffs, and I was terrified of that. I didn't want to marry Warren Jeffs because I didn't have the status, I didn't have the life experiences that would help me advance in his family higher.
Would there be different, as many wives as he had, there would be certain wives that would obviously have favor or the other?
Yes.
I mean, I think Rachel Jeffs talked about this in her book.
Yeah.
That within that whole community there, what is very difficult, even if you were sort of the favorite, because all the other wives, there'd be jealousy and there'd be a lot of competition. That would be the case?
Yes. But with me, I wasn't the favorite, and I knew I never would be. I would be more of a servant.
Wow.
And that didn't sound very exciting to me.
Right.
So I was more terrified. I remember as a teenager, I had a best friend who was like the favorite family. And she was talking one day about Warren Jeffs, and I said, "I get teased all the time about marrying Warren Jeffs." And she says, "If I did, I would love that." And I remember looking at her like, "You would?" Like, I wouldn't love that. And then I realized the difference. She was in the favorite family. She probably would be advanced.
Wow.
In my situation, I knew I would be more of a servant. Like,
It's like a
that
caste
sound good.
society in a sense. Like,
Yeah.
people have their roles. Like,
we all had roles.
Yeah.
It was even harder in his family. Now that I look back and I know emotion and stuff now, I had to keep sweet no matter what in there, and I could never express anything. I could never do anything like this. But now that I recognize, I remember feeling, I just didn't identify it at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't struggle as hard as most of them because I didn't love Warren Jeffs at all. I was kind of like, you guys can have him. And I went overboard with that. And that's what made him ultimately really mad, is that I would just give him away. He's like, "You can't do that every single time." I'm like, "I'm living the doctrine to the T. Love one another. You guys can have him." And he thought I was playing hard to get. And the reality is I didn't really ever bond. I never wanted to.
Yeah.
So, his family, like with polygamy, he had a favorite wife for sure, and she was all the time with him. She was a secretary, and she did most of all of his work, and so he's basically a monogamist. Even though he had, I've heard the number from somebody who has the Texas records is like 79. Ultimately, when he got caught, I don't know if he's had some spiritually sealed since, that happens sometimes.
Yeah.
But so he basically was monogamist, and he did have like his power trip stuff and his things that he would decide he wanted to do, but most of us didn't have any say.
Yeah.
I remember after I went to Texas and I got introduced to some of the stuff that he was doing. And I got introduced. The very first training I got after I married him was a really shocking training. And it was the whole time. So when I went into the ceremony to get married, it happened exactly like my premonitions, except for I didn't wake up. I was already there.
Wow.
I actually went into shock. But it felt like a trap because he's the one that groomed me, basically. He was my principal. He was my,
Just a question real quickly, just totally adding on to what you're saying. With the FLDS believing in polygamy, and that being one of their primary examples. It wasn't until Warren Jeffs took over that he introduced underage marriage, correct?
Well,
Or he obviously ended up
he
acting
took it
upon
to
that.
an extreme.
Right.
He took it to a really strong extreme, the highest extreme that you could possibly take. And that's what he did with everything.
But I guess my question would be, with him when he was the principal, he really worked his way to be empowered. He had planned this for a long time. So in the same way that he was playing his cards to get to the top and to take rule on Jeff's place, going back to the beginning of the podcast when you talked about being in class and you talked about you can either say yes or no, those sort of conversations, that would be grooming,
Yes.
conditioning you for this time to where you are now.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I get into the room and it's identical like my dreams, like it was a warning, and I had a friend who at 14 just all of a sudden, she was a really good girl. Like she was loved by her family, really. I mean, as far as I knew, I went over to her house a lot. She was my age. And at 14, she just upped and left. And she said she felt like she was going to marry Warren Jeffs. She was scared too. She didn't want to. And so I remember my family like laughing about that and just playing these games. Like she was never going to, she just had that in her brain, and I remember thinking, well, I need to find out if this is true, but I don't really want to. But in my brain, it was like part of the grooming too. My family participated in that grooming as well to a great degree. I had all my sisters and brothers, so I'm number 11 of 14. All my sisters and brothers had a cedar chest when they turned 18, full of hope chest stuff, dishes and stuff for when they had this arranged marriage. They would all of a sudden have to be like a household.
Right.
And I didn't have even a cedar chest. So I believe that my mother was planning for me to be a plural wife, which I wouldn't need that. So it played a lot into my story as well, is the grooming. Even it was like grooming from Warren Jeffs down, like they were watching him, and I was in a really tight spot. I didn't know how to fight him. I can't fight somebody who's that high in the church, and so, or else just leave. That would be the ultimate thing, and I wasn't ready for that. Leave all my family and everything. So at 18, when I go into the room, it's exactly like my premonitions were, or whatever, those dreams. And he asked me, has God given you an impression of who you're supposed to marry? And I remember thinking, if I say no, he's going to give me a punishment, because that would be lying, because he groomed me.
Yeah.
If I say yes, then, that isn't what I really want. But I had to choose between either never getting married probably or just submitting. And I didn't know enough about it. I probably would have not done it if I would have known more. But I just said, I wondered if I was supposed to go in the family with my sister, who was in his family already. And he piped up right then and said, you have such a strong testimony of God. Yes. And he approved of it. And he had the ultimate say. But still, I went into shock that night. I remember him sending me home that night with my father, because I wasn't responding after he sent everybody out of the room. He wanted me to just be all, like, we're taught our whole life to resist boys and everything about them. And then overnight, you're just supposed to be so married, I'm like,
Right.
I'm like that, I didn't even know how to. So, he got mad and he sent me home. And I thought it was a blessing. I didn't even register that it was a punishment until like 4 months later. I was just like, oh, this is great. I get to come home. And anyway,
That was the night of your marriage.
that was the night of our wedding.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think it just goes to show like how distorted that world was, where even growing up in the FLDS, the night of your wedding and you being sent away, you're so oblivious to the fact. We're in the real world. That would be like, wait, what happened? Like, what's wrong here? Usually that's very different usually in the real world as far as like a wedding night goes. But
Yeah.
here this happens, and you get kicked out, and you're totally oblivious to the fact that you were being punished. It just shows you to go how left is right and everything's upside down.
Yeah, they literally went in the opposite direction of all the studies that are out here. They did the opposite thing. So the very first training, I was getting to this, the very first training he gave me after 2 weeks, or it was actually, so that day he told me to go and show up at this meeting that was going to be in the morning that usually only the men went to. Our family, only the men went to. It was a work project meeting for donations and stuff. He said, I want you there. And so I went, and then he walked down the aisles and he like passed out corrections to leaders. And it was devastating in my mind. I remember thinking, I married you yesterday. Why would you, like, if you just did this without recommending I want you to do this, like it would have been different. But this is not right. Like we are taught our whole lives in our household, really stressed, emphasized on persuasion through love, which is a Doctrine and Covenants quote. But that wasn't happening.
What does passing out corrections mean? Like, what does that entail?
It's like a note that talks about you lose your family, you're kicked out, like you need to go repent, depending on who you are. Some people, like, those are strong ones, strong corrections. He said they were master deceivers, and he wanted everybody to know about it so that we wouldn't be deceived. And it was just really eye-opening to me that he would just like slam things in my face like that the day after I married to him.
So he was verbally passing out corrections, not like notes handed to people.
I
but
think he
was
passed out notes.
Oh, he passed out notes. Okay.
I don't know for sure, but I think he did. He walked down the aisles and he gave him something.
What did people's faces do when they start reading their notes?
They're sitting next to their wives and they're like gifts to each other, and now they're just like taken away, like I took that gift back, I could only see the backs of them because I was a little bit further back in the room, but it was devastating to everybody. And then and then he told me, like, when I was going to Texas, he told me to listen to his special training, that I had to covenant that I would never tell anybody. And I one of the things like you talked about like the outside world and how we treated them and stuff, and we could tell lies to them all day to protect the real meaningful things. So I've just kind of reversed that, I don't tell lies, but I can say what I need to now and and tell the truth to the outside world.
Yeah, right. So I just got a question. So this is your story, and it's fascinating to hear. But then there's also the broader general story that the public knows about Warren Jeffson, and primarily when he became on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list. And so just looking at the timeline, it said September 2002 is when Warren Jeffs took over, roughly. And then it was roughly around 2005 is when the issues with law enforcement were really getting heavily involved. That's primarily, it said, like in July 2004, a nephew of Warren Jeffs files lawsuits against him, accusing Jeff of sexually abusing him. And so that took place. So along this whole timeline, when eventually became into the public eye and became a big thing, and at the very beginning of the podcast, we played him when he was having his first court appearance after being arrested. So at this time, like, where are you right now along kind of this general timeline?
I was married on January 9th of 2003.
Okay.
Wow, so this was literally just months after.
Yeah,
Wow.
It was, and that's why I was 18 too.
Yeah.
Probably. I think, he knew for a lot longer than that.
Yeah.
But he had to wait until he became a leader,
Right.
And so, like, he sits me down in this meeting and he starts talking about this story about how he was running from the law. And I remember catching that the night of our wedding, like he was talking to my father and he said something about, and that's when it hit me. He's running from the law. But I should have known that probably before that. My mother wasn't invited to the wedding. My father was told to take me on a drive. So I wasn't even wearing my wedding dress or anything. And then
Go ahead. It's
a spiritual wedding, can't be legal ever because polygamy isn't legal in America. And so I sit down in this training and he starts talking about when he took his children, his minors that were under 8 years old, away from his house that was a Target house in Hildale, Utah. That was where he had been living before he became the leader. And in this story, he talks about how God revealed that not one of the biological mothers that actually had those kids were worthy to continue to go with their kids until maybe they qualified later. So he talked about he had 30 mothers that had kids, at least 30. And all in one day, 30 mothers just lost their kids, and he took them away to another place, and they had to qualify. But mothers that didn't have kids could be put over those children.
Right.
But it didn't make any sense to me. That was a red flag to me, and I kind of wanted to be the witness from the inside. I really wanted to know more about those kids.
Yeah.
You know, I have a passion for children, and I always have, and I was really concerned. When I heard that, I remember thinking, that's really weird. You know, foster care is set up solely to reunite parents at all costs. And 30 mothers in one night, God gave him those children, and now he's just saying they're all not worthy, is too extreme. It's just way too. And then later, I experienced living in that house with all of those mothers, and saw them crying and sobbing and praying, and they weren't the kind of mothers that weren't trying.
What does requalification to get your children's back even entail? Like, just
when
whatever's
God
up to Warren
reveals
Jeffs.
that they are now taking the steps that.
This is what sickens me about this is marriage is supposed to be a shadow of the unity that we have with Christ, you know, and it taking a marriage ceremony that we have with two becoming one flesh, but now taking that, throwing it into the dirt, not even having a ceremony, but having it with all these people that literally become a means to the end for just the prophet or the person, instead of actually being in a relationship, a loving, caring relationship like Jesus has with his bride, the body of the church, to sanctify and to make conform them more to his image. Instead, it's to tear them down, put them into the dirt, and just use them as a means to the end. And it's horrible.
And there's no self-care taught at all. It's all, he had a motto of work hard for the privilege of working harder. Warren Jeffs' motto is work hard for the privilege of working harder. And he doesn't teach any self-care. So if you, he teaches work, give everything. And then when you can't anymore, then you get punished and you start with your kids.
Let's take what means probably the most to you in your life, since we don't really even have a relationship as husband and wife, but you have this child now who's part of you, literally born. But now we're going to take that, and I'm just going to take that away from you. I'm going to pull you into the dirt. That's what it sounds like.
It reminds you, the first thing that comes to mind is the story in Bethlehem, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and Herod had all the firstborn children killed because, and there's this wailing heard throughout. And then in the same way, just having a child and essentially kidnapped from you, there is an aspect of severance that's similar, and 30 at the same time. I mean, I've been in the emergency room seeing someone who just lost their child, and just seeing the grief right there. I can only imagine what that would be times 30. And also, not only that, they have distorted doctrine. Their whole view of God, who do they cry out to when their messenger is the prophet who just took their child?
Yeah. So he tells a story in his own words. I don't have the exact scripture with me because it's elite doctrine.
Yeah.
But in these compounds that he set up in Texas, and only have people that he could handpick and call and bring to those places, he had this doctrine about one of his wives. He told this story when she passed away of cancer. He talks about how the day that he took the children away from the property, and her children were among them, and she knew she had cancer, and she was so crying and everything because she didn't know if she'd ever see him again. And he just told her, if you don't accept this, you're going to turn away from the priesthood. And so she just submitted, and she did see him again, but she missed months in between that she could have had if he hadn't done that to her,
Wow.
It's there's so many stories. I knew another lady who tried so hard, harder than anybody I saw in his family. She was always praying, always not socializing because that was a sin. She was always doing all kinds of things to be more loyal and more obedient. Well, her story later was that she was commanded that if she even had a thought about her biological father who had been kicked out since, then that was a sin because he was a bad person. And so that was ultimately what got her kicked out.
How do you follow a commandment like that? Don't
Can't.
talk about your biological father.
It's
What are you
like,
going to think of as soon as you say that? You're going to think about your biological father.
it's like, don't think about the elephant in the room.
Exactly.
And it's
Think
actually
elephants.
part of her DNA, you know? It's
Yeah.
like,
I can't even believe that.
it's just horrible, the things that he has done to tear away people's hope. You know, like he made the standards so impossible for the ones
Yeah.
he didn't want.
And so during this time, you get married to Warren Jeffs. You get sent away because you unknowingly play hard to get.
Yeah.
And here you are. And this is sort of the time frame. We had talked on the phone, and you had said that you were keeping yourselves at distance, and you can shed light into this because you weren't worthy. Or were you trying to get yourself worthy enough to be there, but that's the way you kind of kept distant at that?
When I woke up from the shock,
Mm-hmm.
I started to pick up clues and started to realize what he really wanted.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't for like several months that I really figured out what he was asking for because I didn't have any training on it.
Okay.
Like it's really common actually for people in that religion to just be overlooked, like because they have so many kids, they have, the mothers have all these huge families, and to remember when and how, everything they need to tell each one sometimes just doesn't happen. And because we can only have specific things that we can utilize, like we don't have all the books, we don't have all the internet, we don't have all the TV. So it's really easy to be like not fully educated in like marital things. And so I had to just pick up clues. That was basically even how when Warren Jeffs sent people later after he got caught, and he was furious with me because he could never consummate our marriage. He sent people to her, like really torture me psychologically. And part of that was he used cult doctors, and they would drug me with prescription drugs that he commanded them to give me, or they would lose their family. And part of that was I had no internet, so I couldn't look up any of the diagnosis. This is an example of some of the extremes. I couldn't look up any of the symptoms of what I had. All I could do was listen to the doctors and say, I don't have that. Like, what are the symptoms? Okay, one of the symptoms of bipolar is that if you deny that you have bipolar, that's the first symptom. I'm like, do you have bipolar?
You're asking him that. Doctor, do you have bipolar?
It's like almost like denial is an admission. Someone accuses something, and denial is automatically an admission of guilt.
So
how do you get around that?
Yeah, so I had to really to fight for my life and fight for survival and stuff. I really had to study clues, and that was what I did when I started to listen to Warren Jeffs and hear about some of the stuff that he had going on in Texas and among the elite groups that he was collecting. He ultimately set up these houses in hiding, like I was telling you about that lady who was in a house in hiding with a caretaker. He set those up for people that were called to be among the elite and were struggling. So he set up this middle ground because he didn't want them to associate with people that were never called. He didn't want the knowledge to be too broad.
I'm gonna keep them separated.
He wanted to keep them separated, so he set up this middle ground for the ones that were struggling. And after I got introduced to what he really, like some of the stuff he was doing, I actually asked him if I could go to a house in hiding. Like I was like, I need more time. And I had to fight for it. Like I had to play really naive and, and I was kind of, but at the same time I was like trying to figure it out because I was out of the shock now and I was just like trying to sort through all this download of constant information. And I was like, I just really need more time.
Yeah.
And I was in the meeting when he walked in the room and he told some of the ladies, you can't have more time. You need to go pray harder. You know what you need to do. And, he was just like telling certain ones that they couldn't have that opportunity to go to this house in hiding. And to me, that's really devastating because they were in a compound that they, as far as I knew, was clear out in the distance, and they had a gate around it with a guard tower and they were driving around every 15 minutes. They don't have if he's telling them they can't leave, that's one of the steps. So what I did when he gave me the opportunity to leave, because he bought into what I was saying, because he didn't know me very well. So I go to these houses in hiding, and I told him as soon as I got there, I said, I'm not going to pray to ensure that I don't get called to be among the holy elite people when I'm not ready. And so I used his own doctrine against him, and that was part of it, telling him, I'm not gonna pray. And I don't really know how you can stop praying, because your heart prays all the time. But I went around the whole house and I told him, I'm not praying. If he sends me to this godly elite place when he doesn't send people who are praying every single day, there's something wrong.
Yeah, right.
And so he couldn't take me back. And I stayed there for 2 years and I just read and I wrote him letters and, I just stayed there until he got caught.
So during this time, you already had like red flags in your head about what's going on. So you're trying to learn as much as you can so you can be a source of information to people on the outside in the future. Like, did you think that this was kind of all coming to an end?
I didn't fully have it all puzzled together, but I did figure it out before the 2 years was over.
Okay.
And I was determined to figure it out.
Okay. So let's do this. We've gone for about an hour here, and we still have a lot to unravel. And we're kind of getting the two different cliffhangers, because on one end, in the public record, this is the point where Warren just becomes a fugitive, and I mean, and in your own world, you're using Warren Jeff's language to keep it at arm's distance because you're just trying to figure things out, buy yourself some time, but eventually these two timelines collide.
Yes.
And so what we'll do is we will wrap things up here. We're going to continue in a part 2. And just so you know, just so for all of you know, you drove down today from Colorado City, and you live there now, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So we really appreciate you being in here in studio today, and really appreciate that. And we are flies in the wall here.
Yeah, this
and
is an
it's
amazing
just
story.
It's just wow. And this is one of those amazing. This is one of the most infamous, I would say, stories of people that are familiar with as far as cults in the United States in the last 100 years. And for you to kind of share your story along this timeline that a lot of people are familiar with and maybe not so many people are as familiar with, because this is roughly about 15 or somewhat years later. Definitely really appreciate you coming on today. So we'll wrap things up here, and there will be a part 2 to this as we unravel more of what happened, and also a lot more about the FLDS, where things went with yourself and with Warren Jeffs and all that sort of stuff. So all that being said, we'll wrap things up here. As always, programs like this cannot continue without your support. So we want to offer for you guys to be part of the Cultish crew, ladies and gentlemen.
Cultish crew.
Cultish crew. So you can go to the cultishshow.com, go to the donate tab. You can either donate one time or monthly. So you can allow programs like this, content like this, to be able to continue and have conversations like these. So if you really was blessed by this program, please prayerfully consider doing that. So all that being said, we will talk to you guys next time on Cultish, where we enter into the kingdom of the cults. Talk to you guys soon.